On so many occasions, we've asked you to help people in need, from the storms, for those who are hungry, helping with Christmas gifts. Unfortunately, many times we don't often follow that up on what's happened and how things went. And I'm sorry about that. We're going to try to do better at that. And we're fortunate today to have Nate and Beth Tyson to be sharing with you, because they had a special connection with the folks you helped a number of weeks ago, the people who were devastated by the storms in Florida. Beth and Nate.
Hello, church family. For those of you who don't know us, we're Beth and Nate Tyson. We've been here at Asbury for about 3 years now. Over the years, hurricanes have come and gone over the Florida Panhandle. Floridians have picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, rebuilt, and gone about their business. This year, a different kind of hurricane rolled into the Gulf of Mexico, changing the face of the Florida Panhandle and thousands of lives. On October 10th, we watched in horror as Hurricane Michael, a high Category 4 storm with winds sustained as high as 155 miles per hour, slammed into the small coastal town of Mexico Beach, Florida. With a 14-foot storm surge, this monstrous storm practically scrubbed Mexico Beach from the face of the planet. The coastal towns of Port St. Joe, 12 miles to the east, was battered by the dirty side of the storm. And Panama City and its beach areas to the west were terribly hard hit as well. Michael continued its destructive path to the northeast and moved into South Georgia, still a barely abated Category 3 storm. Along the way, it mowed through small communities that most people have never heard of: Weewawhitchka, Sneeds, Clarksville, Atha, Chattahoochee. Small panhandle communities that are made up of low-income families who work mostly in the area's agriculture. That evening, as the pictures and reports of devastation began to come in, I knew that something had to be done. I could stop worrying myself sick and do something. I stopped wringing my hands and began making phone calls. Now, if you ever want to increase your faith, start a mission project. When you are driven by something other than your own everyday needs and wants, things begin to happen. People respond, doors open, and paths are cleared. God begins to work. The expression "let go and let God" comes to mind. I contacted my broker, who readily agreed to allow our offices in Market Center to be collection sites. The club at Grand Lakes at Southbridge also agreed to help promote a donation drive and be a drop-off site. I knew that we needed a large area to collect and stage donations, so Asbury is a no-brainer. I asked Randy and Billy if we could bring things and leave donations in the social hall until we could make arrangements to get them to the Panhandle, and they were immediately on board. Margaret Cook Levy, who is Asbury's mission director, jumped into action and rallied her troops. Along with other agents from our market center, we collected a pickup truck of cleaning supplies, canned and pet food, and money on Saturday at the Richmond Hill and Publix. That day, we met the disaster coordinator from Coastal Carolina Hospital, who was willing to donate 2.5 pallets of water, weighing in at a whopping 5,000 pounds, as long as we would come and pick it up. Once the announcement about what we were doing went out from Asbury, the donations began to pour in. Various friends posted the donations drive to their Facebook page, and help in other ways began to come in. Pledges of money for transportation. A press release was sent out from Asbury, and the announcement about the donation drive was picked up by the Savannah Daily News. Both WTOC and WJHCL came and did stories on what was happening, and many local folks brought things into the church. We began to realize that we were going to need a pretty big truck. We happened to know the good folks at the Pooler U-Haul, shout out to them, and they waived the mileage on a 20-foot round-trip U-Haul, cutting that rental by half. Logistics began to work themselves out. Boxes and tubs were donated. Laura rallied our youth group, and they collected donations at the Isle of Hope Fall Festival. People, and my truck driver Nate, would ask where we would be taking these things and when we would be leaving. I really had no answer. I just knew that we were being led every step of the way, and there was no reason to worry. We would deal with the logistics later. We continued to pick up at the various drop-off locations and bring things to Asbury. On Monday, we picked up our rented U-Haul and took it to the Coastal Carolina Hospital in Hardyville, where 5 burly construction workers appeared and loaded the pallets of water. On October 23rd, when several of you from Asbury gathered to sort and box the donations, our stage was overflowing, and I was completely overwhelmed and humbled. That evening, more of you showed up and packed our U-Haul nearly full. Throughout this time, we had continued to look into where we would deliver our supplies. One thing that was becoming obvious to us was that the outlying communities north of the coastal panhandle, that although hard hit, were receiving very little attention or aid. We'd been in touch with a local grassroots group who was using an old car dealership in Blountstown, Florida for drop-off and distribution of supplies to the families in the area. They had directed us to a group in Chattahoochee, Florida, who was using Chattahoochee Baptist Church for distribution and even made the initial contact for us. We left early on Wednesday morning, headed for Chattahoochee. In Jacksonville, we made a stop and bought blankets, adult diapers, and bug spray with some of our cash donations. As we got closer to the area, the damage looked worse and worse. It had taken crews more than 4 days to cut through the miles and miles of downed trees and cleared the road that separated the small town from the rest of the world. We pulled up to the front of the church, and a very excited woman came running out, waving her arms. "Are y'all from Savannah?" They already knew we were coming. These folks had been feeding people for days and were nearly out of the few supplies they had. They were thrilled to see us. An elderly, disabled man who had been trapped in his home for several days came in and asked for a broom and a mop at nearly the exact moment that we were unloading them from the truck. We knew right then that we were exactly where we needed to be. We left Chattahoochee and headed to Blountstown, dropping off water to various spots along the way to people who could make use of it. A small evangelical church east of Chattahoochee and a Mennonite group in Sneeds who had come there to give aid, both took some. In Blountstown, we made contact with a group of police officers who directed us to the Mossy Pond Library near Atha, Florida. We drove several miles through areas of devastation like nothing we had ever seen before. Mossy Pond Library is literally in the middle of nowhere. Once we arrived, we realized that this library had been converted into a temporary Red Cross shelter for folks who had been displaced. Rows of porta potties, kids playing outside, and volunteers from Mississippi cooking meals under a tent, with most folks just wondering what to do next. Inside the library, we found people who'd been sleeping on cots and on the floor amongst the shelves of books. It was surreal in a post-apocalyptic kind of way. The Red Cross volunteers who were there jumped into action and unloaded the final 2 pallets of water with a huge forklift. With our U-Haul empty and our hearts heavy, we headed south to the coast. Through Weewawhitchka and Port St. Joe, we saw extensive damage. Once we got to my hometown, the damage was still apparent, but minimal compared to what we had just seen. We headed home to Savannah on Friday. Once back home, we regrouped and immediately began to plan our next trip down. We still had nearly $4,000 in monetary donations to get into the hands of people that needed it. I got back on the phone and made contact with the First United Methodist Church in Blountstown, Florida. I talked with a nice lady named Beth, who assured me that there would be someone available to meet with us when we got to Blountstown. This old church had weathered the storm, but come through with extensive damage. A huge hole was ripped open over their lovely sanctuary where their steeple had been. The steeple itself was lying mostly on the roof. Despite their damage, they were open to the community, offering hot meals, showers, and warm hearts. Once in Blountstown, at the church, we dispatched most of our gift cards with Pastor Nick, who was grateful for the efforts being made on behalf of his community. and said he knew plenty of good folks who were in desperate situations and could certainly use one of our gift cards. We left Pastor Nick with promises to return to their community in the future with help in tow. Now, you need to know that we didn't leave all of the cards there. The big aid organizations and the television networks have moved on, and our attention spans are short. But these folks are still hurting. It is our plan to begin preparations for a third mission trip into the area. This one will look a little different. We plan to use the remaining donations and the $2 per Christmas tree that our youth raised to buy supplies and materials and head back into the area to assist with cleanup and rebuilding. We don't know yet what that trip may look like, who of you may want to come along, or even exactly when it will happen. If a trip, sleeping on a church floor, eating mediocre food, serving some hurting people, and not knowing where God will lead you sounds like fun, then please let us hear from you. Now, one thing that I learned a long time ago was that my mission isn't necessarily going to be your mission. You may not have the same hearts for the same cause that I do, but I know this. The people of this church in Savannah, Georgia, made my mission their mission. We all know that living in paradise has its perils. Any hurricane season, this could happen to us, and that we could never be fully prepared for a disaster of this magnitude, and you stepped up. You gave from your heart to people you've never seen and may never meet. You gave to them because I asked you to, and because you love us, the Tysons, you also love my people. This is what being the hands and feet of Christ means. Words could never express the gratitude that I have for this church and its people. Thank you.